Good afternoon from Hong Kong and from Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I'm Executive Director Alice Mong, and this is what a great pleasure for me today to kind of kick off a program that we've been working on for a while. Women and the COVID-19 recovery, rebuilding a more equal private sector in Asia. And the program came about is a collaboration between Asia Society Hong Kong and International Finance Corp IFC, and we're really delighted today. We also we have some Rana Karachi from IFC to join us, and then also Laura Cummings from JP Morgan Chase. I'm going to leave the introduction of these two distinguished speakers to Diana David, but I'm going to take an opportunity to quickly introduce our moderator, Diana David. She's a former Financial Times executive, and Diana has a wonderful book out that I'm sure I'm going to let her talk about the book. In fact, I think, Diana, we need to do a book program on your book. I think we have done it, as I recall. But anyway, we may need to do it again. But Diana is an Asia 21 fellow and has been a longtime Asia Society Hong Kong member, and we're really delighted that she can help moderate today's discussion. I'm really delighted that today, the last day of March, we're still part of the International Women's Month, that we can talk about this topic. As some of you know, we've been talking about COVID-19 as an update since the COVID started in Hong Kong around January, February of last year. And we've been talking about more of the scientific, the origin of the vaccine as well as COVID itself. But we have not spent as much time talking about some of the social impact of COVID-19. So it was a delight when IFC suggested this, that we really are happy to be able to collaborate on this program. And I know the three speakers today will do it justice so that we can shed light on some of the issues. I think this month has been full of celebration of women, but also it's been tragedy for women. We know what happened in Atlanta, where, unfortunately, some of these women were casualty of this, the economic situation. I think it's in memory of these women, these working women, that I want to dedicate today's program. Because again, their stories are not talked about, and COVID has this hidden story. And I know today's speaker will touch upon some of these issues and how we can make a better world post-COVID for women in the workforce, the women who are impacted greatly by this COVID. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diana to get the program started. Diana.
All right. Thank you so much, Alice, and thank you for the introduction. Yes, it's exciting to be here to talk about how we can bounce back to a more equal private sector. And I'm really pleased today to have Rana Karadsheh, who is the Regional Industry Director for Manufacturing, Agribusiness and Services, huge portfolio for South Asia and East Asia and Pacific for the International Finance Corporation. She manages a diverse team located in 16 offices across the region with 20 years of experience in the field of international investing and finance, and will come with both research and some great stories of companies that she knows who are bouncing back and thriving. Also with us, we have Laura Cumming, who's the head of JP Morgan's Asia Pacific Country Risk Management Team, and is also the Hong Kong Chief Risk Officer for a number of the firm's regulated entities. She's been in banking for 35 years with roles spanning across a number of different groups and regions, and has been based in Hong Kong since 2016. And I'm your moderator, Diana Wu-David. And as Alice mentioned, I have written a book called Future Proof, Reinventing Work in the Age of Acceleration in 2019. And making work for people is one of my passions. So I am super excited to introduce our panel and to have a great conversation. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, Diana.
Great to be here. Thanks so much. So a lot has been written about the disproportionate health and economic impacts on women due to COVID-19. And there has been a huge exacerbation of existing inequalities, unfortunately, in terms of job loss, increased care of others, mental health burden, digital and financial access. So I just wanted to put things in context, because both of you and others have done some interesting research. And so I just completely subjectively pulled some statistics. Women's job losses in COVID were 1.8 times higher than male job loss rates. And US female labor participation is at a 33-year low. So we're really talking here about rebounding and getting back to the starting line of where we left, and then hopefully going even further. Digital access is an issue, with the GSMA saying 51% of women in South Asia do not have access. Women do a disproportionate share of unpaid care work. And this is probably my favorite statistic. In Turkey, men were doing, during COVID, 5 times more than before, which is still half of what women were doing, according to UNDP. So one of the reasons we're here is that 1 in 8 governments had programs to protect women during COVID-19. And a lot of that burden or opportunity has fallen to the private sector. But there hasn't been that many studies showing how these impacts affect business and how private sector leaders can take advantage of this unique opportunity as we rebuild, to do so with a focus on gender equality that sets them up for longer term success. So by closing gender gaps, we hope that companies can unlock opportunities for increased profit growth and innovation, and also improve health and safety in the workplace. So that's sort of the setting for our conversation. And Rana, I wanted to start with you and just to ask you for some particularly good examples you might have for gender inclusive policies and practices that you've seen in your sectors.
Thank you, Diana. I mean, I think your statistics are very, very telling. This is something that, you know, IFC, it's really one of our priorities. And we've seen the impact on gender through COVID in so many different ways. If I can, let me add just a few other points in addition to what you shared, because I think it you know, as you dig into these numbers, you realize how it affects, you know, women in the workforce in so many different ways. So one, as you said, the job losses for sure. I think I also read that ILO had statistics which show that 32 million, you know, jobs for women were wiped out across just Asia Pacific alone. So you see job losses, you see it in the nature of the jobs that women do. Right, so you know, 70% of workers in healthcare often are women. So women are at the front line of this contagion. Women tend to be in the informal sector, and that's where you don't see a lot of these statistics. And they're also in MSMEs, micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, often run by women. Those are the ones that are hit. And then, as you also rightly mentioned, the structure, their familial structure also impacts how they are able, you know, to react and how it impacts them, right? Family needs, childcare, you know, unpaid care, as you mentioned. And the other thing that I think is worth mentioning, and that'll segue me into one of the examples I'd like to highlight, is gender-based violence. One of the things that we've seen statistics have shown is I have here, it says, you know, a 20% increase during the first 3 months of lockdown, domestic violence cases. So going into what we've seen that has worked, gender policies, and I would say these would apply both during the pandemic and before, but during the pandemic, you've seen when they've had these policies, how it can really materialize and show impact. So let me give you one example here, which I think is very interesting. There's a company that we've worked with. It's you know, the company called Wormold, and it's in Fiji. You know, this one I would say is an interesting case of knowledge and capacity building and training. And so what this company was experiencing before they undertook a review and assessment was something around a 75% attrition rate. You know, in 2018. So absenteeism became, you know, ordinary course of business. And so this company started investigating into this, looking deeper to say, okay, what's going on here? Why is there so much, you know, attrition? And what they found were high incidences of bullying, sexual harassment, and family care issues. So they said, okay, we have to address this. We need to solve this. So they embarked on a process to strengthen the organization's resilience and to build a culture of respect. So they went through, you know, participating in IFCs. It's called the Rako program. It's an initiative that IFC has with, you know, Fiji Human Resources Institute and governments of Australia and New Zealand. But suffice it to say, it's an initiative that they underwent to sort of try and address the issue. And so the causes of that. So what they did was they looked at ways of increasing resilience and building a culture of respect in the workforce. And so really it was knowledge building, capacity, understanding, And so, fast forward to 2020, and if you look at Fiji, in addition to the COVID crisis, they had, suffered a couple of tropical cyclones. So on top of that, so, they really, had challenging situation last year. Company had no job loss during that time. So, which I think is amazing. So how were they able to do this, right? So they did it, like I said, they dug in, they realized what were the issue, and they brought women into the conversation to find out how to do, how do we address this? So women participated in finding solutions. So solutions became, how do you manage your schedule, right? Prioritizing, shifts that work better for the women in the workforce, in their workforce, helping them manage family care responsibilities, right? Giving them flexibility in the workplace, and I think very importantly, educating, right? Updating anti-harassment, anti-bullying policies, boosting this on social media platforms. So very simple things, but if you look at what was 75% attrition to 0 job losses last year, huge impact, right? And these have economic impacts on companies. And we've have others where we've had, I'll just maybe mention just one more, a client of ours, Apollo Hospitals in India. And what they've done, and as I mentioned earlier, women often are at, there's 75% of the healthcare is women in that workforce. So they introduced flex timing, rotation of duties. So for example, people who were working on the front desk had the option to work in the middle office, which gave them the opportunity to work from home, and sometimes where you had to be in the center. So that flexibility, and it helped create a better enabling environment for female employees, for all employees. They provided transportation so that people could avoid public transportation, testing support. They created virtual town halls to help knowledge and understanding. They built temporary backup facilities, introduced immune boosting foods, and then the nurses that were in the hostels, they gave them groceries and necessities. And it's interesting, often when we make investments, we say, okay, if you're gonna kind of build a resilient company, you have to de-risk the environment to enable investments to come in. And I look at this in a way as a company sort of de-risking their the work environment to enable people to be even more productive. So I think just these two examples, I think touch on that.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. And I think that what we found overall is that risk, when it's well managed, becomes, an opportunity. And I like the idea of setting expectations and flexibility and measuring and getting feedback and kind of iteration. Laura, can you tell us, we have examples from Fiji and India. Can you tell us from your own experience what kind of gender inclusive policies you've seen that are working?
Sure, happy to, Diana. And a lot of what Rana says resonates with what I'm going to say, but I'm going to take it to a JP Morgan perspective, but also global in terms of some of the policies that we've adapted. And I also want to make a comment that, we're focused on bringing gender equality to the workforce, but I think what we've seen is that there's broader issues in terms of diversity and inclusion in the private sector. And COVID, in fact, had an impact not just on the female labor participation, but I think also in terms of class and racial impacts. And so the comments I'm going to make generally around diversity and inclusion cover all, but then I'll get to some specific maybe female policies. So what I've experienced in my 29-ish years or something with JP Morgan and predecessor firms is a real growing focus on end-to-end programs and awareness around equality. And I think it's not just in terms of hitting numbers and bringing in female into the firm at the beginning, which we're pretty good at. There's about a 51% female to male ratio right now for this summer's intern program globally across the world. But you have to have a diverse slate of candidates. So that's one area that we focus on, is sort of, the bring in part. How do you bring in women into, the firm? But then the critical point tends to be, over the next 20 years, is how do you retain and develop women? And so there's a lot of both internal networking groups, training sessions, coaching of women to help them develop their skills, make the kind of connections and networks that will help them be successful in their career, and provide them leadership opportunities, aside from what their day-to-day job is. So I think that retention and development is very important. And then more recently, what the firm is very focused on is also bringing awareness to some of the unconscious biases that people have at all levels of the firm. And so there are training programs around unconscious bias and tools to deal with it. There's great acronyms that I think that are out there, SEEDS programs and whatnot. And managers are being held accountable to develop that kind of awareness and to take that kind of training. And they're accountable to make that awareness part of their own team's DNA. So really being informed on that. And I guess, finally, I would say that there's a real concerted effort to make some improvements, if you will, in the actual metrics that we can use to measure diversity and inclusion. And that comes both from the top down, and also I think in terms of what we can do, not just within JP Morgan as a firm, but as good citizens and communities. So sort of pivoting to some of the other bits of what we do for diversity and inclusion would include, commitments that our CEO has recently made off the back of last year's terrible events that happened in the US around racial injustice, actual financial commitments, multi-year commitments to direct our resources, our financing, our presence, if you will, in different areas to support that. So whether that's affordable housing, whether it's educating women and different racial pockets on how to invest wisely. And there's really the desire to bring good from that. That's not really self-serving just to help, right, a JP Morgan or a corporate bottom line, but it's really to try and have an outreach and to close the inequality gap more broadly. So maybe I'll just pause there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it really makes me think, because I looked at the Women on the Move from JP Morgan and the kind of pillars of employees, but then also financial literacy and access to financing. And you can look at that across many different categories, women, et cetera. And I'm just wondering if in the future, what are you doing to provide that? In particular, access to financing and insurance, because that's been a big topic over the last year, even beyond COVID. And then also whether or not you think that there's merit in starting to really measure and collect data on what works best. And I think about it from the idea of personalized education for, corporate and in our schools. Do you think there's going to be more data-driven personalized access to financing where we find better ways to give people access?
Yeah, I think that data literacy is huge, and I'm, still probably of the generation that I myself am going up a curve on how that's used. JP Morgan Research, which is a separate group from us, is using data analytics in ways that are just astounding, just in able to siphon through an enormous amount of data to look at different trends and come up with different forecasts on how businesses or industries or economies are growing. I think for financial inclusion, for what we're talking about, it's really as simple as actually one, and you see this as a huge issue in Asia, is even establishing a bank account, forget a digital bank account, but just even establishing a bank account. And I think it's very difficult in some of the countries that are probably underserved in Asia. And one way that they've actually had some success in doing that is through creating more of a digital access. So I know India is doing that in terms of, banking online. And I think any of the companies that are involved in the finance industry right now are trying to figure out, where is their niche? What is the right way to help move into this digital age, and to make finance more accessible? I mean, you look at in the US, there's a huge amount of call it the age 20 to 30 that are now doing, investing $1 at a time, a US dollar at a time through an online phone app, Robinhood. And so there's a lot of, there's some upside to giving that kind of exposure early on to that demographic, but there's also a lot of risks in that kind of investing that they don't fully appreciate yet. So I think for banks, there's probably a role to be played in terms of, helping to educate people on how best to save, invest, but to do it in a form that you don't have to walk into a physical location anymore, and that you can use what the new generation is being brought up on, which is, something as big as your hand, that you can use wherever you walk, wherever you go.
That's really fantastic. So I like the policies, and I like the idea of access to finance. One of the bigger policies that's really specific to women is, and in particular has been like a awareness, a bright spot of COVID-19, as it were, is that it led many companies to realize the importance of providing staff with employer-supported childcare services. So I'm just curious, and Rana, maybe you can start. How common are these globally and among your clients? And what kind of benefits have you seen companies reap from providing such services? And how can they implement them on a cost-effective basis? Because I think that there's a real fear that once the door is open, it's going to be a huge issue, and it'll be like defined benefit pensions were. So they seemed like a good idea at the time until they didn't. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's, this, and I had touched on it earlier, right? If they don't have, because women often disproportionately have to deal with the childcare support, and I think for me as a working mother, childcare, and I'm sure for many, it's just a huge issue. It's a cost, it's logistics, it's it's a challenge, and so that's something that IFC has been very, very keen on working with, and sort of on child supported healthcare. We have so just let me share. I'll just flip through some of my statistics here, on this. So let me give you some interesting data here, right? As you said, it's still pretty rare, right? A few points here of interest. As of 2019, only 26 developed and emerging markets economies had introduced a legal requirement for companies to provide supported childcare. So 26. It's very few. There's more that we're seeing that are adopting family-friendly policies. I think some people, as awareness is kicking in, like the example that I gave in Wormold in Fiji, you start to realize addressing some of these gaps, right, have seen positive outcomes in terms of workforce retention, in terms of continuity, resilience in the business. And we're seeing people introduce things like paternity leave, flexible work hours, parent resource groups, some other selected childcare support like after school, summer camps. All of these initiatives are really important to kind of helping. And in some cases, we're finding that they may need to provide actually direct child care support. So sometimes it's just broader support by providing extra flexibility, extra support, maternity and paternity leave, and resources. And in some cases, what we're finding is that companies will benefit from on-site childcare near the workplaces. So we have studied the business case for employer-supported care in 8 countries in Asia Pacific. So let me give you an example. In Vietnam, the garment factories. We invest in the garment factories in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, across the globe. And many of those, I'm sure most people are aware, bulk of the employment is, the employees are women. So just in Vietnam, for example, we saw that when they had introduced childcare facilities near one of their facilities, worker turnover was cut in half, 50%, just from that alone.
That's amazing.
And another factory group, which did not implement this, saw turnover rates were 16 times larger than in factories, than with those that had on-site care. So those economics, when you're talking, business and economics and bottom line, things like that have an impact. I mean, think from where you are, right? From your perspective, if you consistently, you're training employees, you're working with your staff, and you constantly have to, lose and then rehire people. I mean, that comes at a cost, inefficiencies, management time, resources. So, that's not an insignificant impact. I have one here. We have data actually from one company. So here, Safaricom, which is Kenya's biggest mobile operator, right? It has 2 on-site, what we call creches in Nairobi. Cost was minimal. We estimated just over 33,000, right? Just to build that, right? Which is just a fraction of the company's, 1.8 billion in sales. So these things are very, very marginal. If you look at, 16 times higher turnover people in companies that did not have on-site care versus those that do, I think that also makes dollars and cents. And this is we're taking this conversation across, not just Asia, across the globe, to help educate a lot of our clients to understand that it's just sometimes a small upfront investment that you need for better resilience and staff retention.
That's fantastic. And it leads into my next question a little bit, which is, I know in the JP Morgan report, it quotes, labor flexibility for women is a double-edged sword, as it often comes with greater vulnerability in the form of lower job security and wages. And I just thought that really summed up the dilemma for many women. So I was wondering, Laura, if you could talk a little bit about even your own experience, what we can do to ensure this doesn't happen. In a way, a creche is actually a great thing. It doesn't have to be as flexible because childcare is on site. But what are some other experiences you've had or things that you've seen that would make sure we didn't have to have that trade-off?
Yeah, sure. I would, I'll share a personal experience, but I also want to put some context or follow Rana's comments. I do think there's a number of things that help women join the labor force. Childcare is absolutely one of the most, discussed and critical issues for that. However, I think we need to be careful that we don't raise just the percentage of women in the labor force, but they're in the jobs that are the least or the lowest paying or the most vulnerable or with the least benefits. And I think we actually, just looking from my country risk cap perspective, to some extent, Japan was very successful in increasing the female labor participation rate, back in, over a decade ago, and they brought it up to a peak of 51% more recently. But the female labor is still in the lower paid jobs. So if you look at a study that I've seen from JP Morgan, it looked at, US females in professional jobs, excluding services. So more, again, in maybe finance, accounting, legal areas like that, it's almost 13%. And you compare that to Japan, and it's something like 2%. So I think we also need to be mindful that, it's not, that it's also the type of jobs, opportunities, and benefits that women need. And so back to your question of my personal experience, I've been in banking, as you've just heard, my whole career. But there was, a point when I chose to take a sabbatical for my family and personal reasons. And I took time off from banking for a year. And when I came back in, I wanted to ease back in, if you will. And so I came back in on a part-time basis, which very quickly over the next 4 years went from a few days a week to, your normal many, many more days than we actually technically get paid for. But so what I experienced in that is that there was a real perception that because I was off and then back part-time, that I was not committed to my career, which is not at all, the case. And fast forward to where I am now, I don't think people that know me today would even know that I took that time off or went through that perception issue of having to demonstrate that I was still committed to my career. So I think the challenge for a lot of these flexible jobs for women is that there is a perception that they're not as committed, they're not as aggressive or focused on their career objectives, or maybe they're just more vulnerable because they're flexible hours. And what I hope is one thing that comes out of COVID is that what used to have a bit of a stigma associated with it for women that did work 4 days, let's say, in the office and 1 day at home, whatever kind of flexible schedule they might have had. I mean, COVID effectively put everyone in a remote/flexible work situation. And so as we return to work now, my hope is that that stigma is no longer there, and that for anyone that they need to balance, whatever their personal or home requirements are, that they'll have more flexibility, and that we'll start to look at performance and output rather than, where you're doing your work from, how much face time you have with other people. So that's maybe one bright spot that can come out of COVID.
Incidentally, thank you, Laura. LinkedIn, I heard just before I got on this panel, just put in stay-at-home parent as one of the job categories in the drop-down menu, which in COVID is a little weird because I feel like, does that make me stay-at-home parent / stay-at-home executive, or because everybody's at home? But it'll be interesting, most of all because of the data in terms of when people decide to take those breaks, what they do after, and I think it will allow us to potentially solve problems and maybe reduce some of that stigma.
Indeed. And I can add just maybe one more thing on that too, because I think, again, sort of this whole, woman end to end across all different levels of the workforce is that and JP Morgan also has some great stats on this from our research team. I think you need more women at the board level who are really sitting around the table and helping to direct the policies and ensure that there are policies in place that are supportive for the needs of their employees and for, again, gender and, equality across all of that workforce. And so if, back to your earlier question on, what are the business case? There's moral cases, there's business cases, right? There's all sorts of reasons. But I think even if you just look at some of the stats on companies that have more female involvement at the board level, they're much more successful in all the categories that you can think of, from employee satisfaction to financial results.
Absolutely. Hear that, Hong Kong board nominating committees? So I actually want to hop to a question because it sort of fits in that somebody asked in the Slido. And that was, do cultural and ethnic differences play a significant role in terms of the gender equality in some of these programs? Because you're both playing globally. And I'm just wondering, how do you make those fit for purpose? Or do you need to?
Maybe I should kick it off since we're International Finance Corporation. So that's the start of the name. I think before I do that, I also wanted to react to something that Laura said. I fully agree with what she said in terms of, where women are placed within the hierarchy of an institution at the board and management, because I think, that's helps to increase awareness, increase resilience, and I think studies have shown that has really helped improve. Like companies where they have the diversity do better, generate net better, are more profitable, have a wider client base. One thing that from where I sit, where we also want to continue to make sure is out there in terms of the discussion would be, taking care of people that are at the bottom of the pyramid, and for those that may not necessarily have the ability to move up, and just securing jobs and making sure, because those are the ones that tend to be the most vulnerable in the economy, and they are disproportionately women. So I think those policies, and how we do, and the awareness and how we support them is going to be critical, right? So I think that needs to be continued to be a very important part of that discussion. And just on that, one interesting thing, and this kind of will segue into possibly how you manage this country by country and cultural awareness. But I want to mention one thing, that on sort of policy side and legal side is interesting. So, the World Bank, and IFC, we do an annual report, women, women in the law, right? And it's women, business, and the law. That's what it's called. And we look at 190 economies across the globe. And I'm wondering if any of you can guess how many countries have no legal differences between men and women on equal rights and participation in the economy. 5, 6. Okay, I'll just pause. I won't put anybody on the spot, but it's 10.
Anybody want to put something? I don't know if they're allowed to access the chat.
Yeah,
they're all on Slido.
It's only 10.
Only out of
how 190 countries.
Remarkable.
Right. So if you're talking, so yes, cultural, but you're also looking at legal, right? Legal differences. So I'll just run through the countries that are Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Ireland, Latvia, Luxembourg, Portugal, and Sweden. So those were the only 10.
Canada.
The rest, all the rest, there's differences. And where are those differences? Mandating same pay for same job, right? Where that's a legal requirement, right? Requiring companies to report on their gender indicators and performances, right? And stock exchanges requiring it on gender balance on boards, things like that. So, this is just an indicator of legally we have a ways to go. And so when you have that gap, so that's one area of looking that you need to, that has an impact if you're looking across the globe, culturally, legally, how things are, different parts of the world. And then, directly to your question, Diana, in terms of cultural differences, I would say absolutely, it does make a difference. I mean, so from me, I'm from the Middle East. And I think that's a part of the world where you do see challenges for women in the workforce. And of course, we're aware in Asia, right? It's very cultural as well. Some of these countries that I've noted where there were no legal gaps, they tended to be Northern Europe. And of course, we had Canada in there. So I do think that cultural differences comes into play. And this is where I would come in to say that where knowledge building, capacity building, training, understanding becomes increasingly important, because you have to do it in the way that each culture and sometimes each industry understands. And what we find, because we're often dealing with many social issues because of the nature of how IFC invests, and if you can communicate it to companies, to governments in a way that they can see what's the benefit, right? So it's not just an obligation, I think it should be, but it's also how is this translated into better economic performance, better financial performance, increasing resilience of a company. And I think, and some of this comes into play through culture, how you understand the culture, how they operate, right? What are the obligations of women? What are the perceptions? And then you cater that training and knowledge and capacity building to the local environment and the unique situation that each company may face itself in. I think it very much comes into play. And so I think it's something that it's critical, and I think it's a constant exercise. I don't think it's something you do once and you're successful. I think you have to, there's a constant effort on capacity building. We've seen it in many American companies for that matter. So yeah, we're hoping to increase from 10 to maybe 50 countries where equal treatment in the law will be over the next couple of years.
Well, I hope so. That sounds like it would be a good idea. And I know it's a challenge because, Laura, I mean, I've worked for Financial Times. We had people all over the world. And I was so impressed when actually Financial Times went to a global maternity policy, and now they also have a paternity policy as well. And it's just groundbreaking because, you know, I when I was in Hong Kong, it was something like 8 weeks and 9 months in the UK. And so being able to normalize that, it's it's a big jump. And what do you see in terms of trying to manage that across different countries? You've been so many different places, but in the same company.
Right. Yeah, I'm still absorbing the 10 countries only. What I think is remarkable is that I think all but Canada were in Europe, which really says a lot about maybe a very progressive attitude there, that it would be good for some of the other countries to learn from that. And I think just one other comment on that, I see also in the environmental space, Europe is quite progressive too. So right now there's this increased focus on ESG generally, but I do think that as we're all getting better at actually looking at them as individual types of risks or you know, environmental, social, and governance, and we have more, again, data-driven information to track that there'll be more focus on the S bit, and maybe that will permeate into some of the changes in regulations that will make you know, the legal approach, at least between men and women, more equal. For me personally, I've seen, I think I'm from the United States, and I was brought up, I went to an all-girls school for the first many years of my life. I was always taught to believe, well, that there was no difference. And so I never actually identified any kind of differences, if you will, for the longest time. And in a way, some of that awareness started first just more about probably race and nationalism rather than gender. I had left this firm for a brief stint and worked at a Japanese bank in the early 90s. And I remember the perception then at the time was that I would suffer because I was a female. And what I found is it wasn't a male-female thing at all. But at that time in New York, you know, you were either part of sort of the inner circle of, you know, the Japanese community that had come over as senior managers in the firm, or you were not. So you were in the circle or you were out. And maybe that was one of my earlier memories, at least professionally, right, of sort of how do you deal with that. And then I had moved to London, and I worked in London, where we covered transactions in all countries around Europe. And the cultural awareness, just back to it, I mean, the first thing you have to do is be aware and step back and understand that your way of doing things isn't necessarily how it's done in each of these other places. And now here I am in Asia. And again, I think there's many different cultural differences and perceptions on gender, on race, on a style, and a management leadership. So I do think that global firms need to also educate employees, you know, on awareness. And having consistent policies is a challenge for big companies, but it's important in the areas that are for the better of employees to have that consistency. And I do see that, again, you know, for JP Morgan, we have an employee kind of health line that people can call. And I think in the US, there's less hesitation to do that, right? If you need any support, and it's not just health, it's an assistance, whether you need legal guidance on selecting hospitals, schools for your children, they're there as a resource. But I think in Asia, there's a bit of a perception that that's not a good thing if you need to call and do that, or maybe it's a trust thing. You know, is the information that I share with this resource going to be kept confidential and not, you know, a phone call to my manager the next day? So I think the bigger and more global a firm is, the more work they have to do, one, to understand what are the differences and concerns in the different countries and cultures that are represented, but then two, still be consistent and find a way to help alleviate some of those concerns that are coming up from the cultural differences.
That's interesting. So one of our questions was actually specifically Japan in terms of cultural differences. And it's interesting to hear your perspective. I also, in the early 90s, worked in Korea and remember being worried about being a woman and then getting there and realizing that that had nothing to do with it. I just was alien because of being an American parachuting into South Korea at that time. So what do you both think then about some of the legal and policy gaps? What can governments do? Like what is the, one of the one or two biggest things that governments could do to facilitate the private sector building back in a more equal way? Rana, do you have ideas? What about those 180 other countries?
I
Where do
think
they start?
equal pay for equal work is a good start. I think that's an amazing thing that doesn't even exist. It's always shocking to see that that's even controversial. I think there are things like the other thing is inheritance law. I think can make a big difference as well, because you create economic disparity with that. These are things that I think a couple of things that have been ability, to own land, some to own property, right? So that gives you personal as well as other means of financial security. If you don't have that, I think these are some of the big glaring things that you see that I think will, if you think of so many places in the world where you have single parent households, right? Disproportionately, it's women. So imagine if these women don't have the right to own property, land, it creates not just vulnerability for them, but their entire family. I think these are some very small things that can happen. Maybe it's also, worthwhile for me to mention, we've also recently launched a report called COVID-19 and gender equality, right? Interesting, okay, topical. And it lists 6 key actions that companies can do, that the private sector can do to, ensure that both men and women can return to the workplace, during and can continue in the workplace during and then return after the pandemic, and participate as leaders, employees, business owners, and consumers. And so if it's okay, I'll go ahead and just cite some of them. And sometimes, like I said, they're very simple things, but you have to be conscious, you have to be deliberate about these things, and you have to see them through. You can't just say them. So, so deliberate effort to retain female employees during and after the crises, right? So be very conscious of what's happening to your workforce. So, and then provide support to employees and others with increased care demands. Again, we've mentioned that, but you have to be very conscious and deliberate about it. Ensure respectful workplace cultures. And I think Laura mentioned this early on in some of her remarks. This is cross-cutting. This is, for not just gender, but across the board. Support, again, it was mentioned mental health and well-being. I think we've seen it during COVID, the increased need for this, and not all companies are providing this. And I would not underestimate the need for mental health and well-being support. Even for some of the most resilient people, we see them working around the clock, and that sheer exhaustion and the need for that well-being support is there. Considering the digital divide, again, I think Laura also mentioned that. I think the gender digital divide can be quite great. And if I go back to some of the earlier comments that women are often in the micro MSMEs, informal sector, so that gap would increase, and then building, more resilient supply chains, supporting women entrepreneurs with access to finance and markets. And what we've seen is lending to some of these women, small businesses, banks that actually lend to find that their portfolio of micro borrowers, women micro borrowers, they're what we call in banking, I'm sure Laura knows this as the chief head of risk, is NPLs, right? Non-performing loans. That ratio tends to go down with female borrowers than male borrowers. So it all kind of, in my mind, comes together. Very basic, very simple, but very deliberate steps that you need to take.
And follow through on.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Anything to add, Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I think very well summarized by Rana, and I think absolutely it has to be deliberate policy actions. If I were to just maybe cut it down to 3 things that governments can do, so I'm going to make this a government comment. One is definitely on the overall, health and well-being policies. Continue to promote policies that are supportive for women. And I wanted to just cite one example recently in New Zealand, where they actually passed a law just, I think, last week that allows for an additional days off without using sick days for women and men who where their family has had a miscarriage. So I know we talk a lot about maternity and paternity leaves, but I think, the more you think about health and wellness, you need to broaden that. And again, the fact that they've offered that to men and women is a nice recognition. So health and wellness, supportive childcare, all these things, I think, is number 1. 2, again, Rana covered it, but it's, directing financial support, whether it's women entrepreneurs or just directing funding so that women can have access or to the same opportunities, because there are some stats that show, women, small businesses can succeed as much as men, but they don't have the same access to funding, and therefore they never reach they never optimize their potential. So I think the financing is an important piece of it. And I guess maybe also on financing, if you look at some of the programs, particularly during COVID, some of the countries like Australia approached it as they call it the job seeker program. So they directed money to help while you're looking for a job, while you're building your skills. So it was really to keep people in the workforce, whereas many other countries just gave out, money to people who are unemployed. That doesn't have quite the same momentum to get you the skills and, back into the workforce. And I guess the third thing for me, and again, I'm big on trying to have the women's voice at the table of the policy making. So whether that's at JP Morgan, right, as a private firm, or for governments at the government level. And again, I'm going to steal a stat from actually Lowy Institute, but they said something like 7% of countries' senior leadership, government leadership, is women, and that's just just simply not enough. So I think governments can be more effective if they have more women at the table, making and helping to decide policies on this topic.
Okay, I'm going to take a bit of a pivot because of the questions that are showing up on Slido. I think I've hit a lot of the ones that are sort of government and policy and company related, but there are a lot of questions about the two of you. So I thought I would end, since we have about 5 minutes, with a question that kind of encompasses many of them, which is really, what keeps you going and builds your resilience as a woman leader?
Rana, I've made you go first each of the last few times. If you want, I'm happy to go first.
You go, Laura.
Actually, so one is keeping perspective. I love what I do, and I am very energized, but I have to, I think always my family is my absolute, like, what keeps me going, what gives me resilience. That is sort of an important anchor in everything that I do professionally. And I work hard to never lose sight of that. I think there are times when I have in the past, and somehow or another, maybe just, experience and not getting as worked up as I used to when I was younger. But that, and 2, yoga, honestly, doing that breathing. And I think that helps with the perspective too. And 3, I have, as part of my family, I have 2 daughters. And so hope, and seeing that the future for them, everything I do can influence their future. And so that's kind of full circle back to, in a way, everything I do is about them. Not everything if they're listening, but they're an important piece of my resilience.
I haven't seen any comments from them on Slido yet. Rana, how about you?
So, not too different from what Laura said. I think you want a couple of things. Nobody's an island, right? So, you need your support system. I think if I look back at, how I'm able to manage, and I think all of us have worked 17-hour days during COVID because you just kind of, the days bleed into the night, you lose track of that. And so we're all working very hard. And if I think of what's helped me, it's all of my the infrastructure around me, meaning my family. My husband's a huge supporter. I couldn't do anything without him. I could not be successful without his support. Extended family, my friends, trusted colleagues, right? So there's no superman or superwoman that exists, right? They're only on, what is it, the planet he came from? Not kryptonite, but I can't remember where he came from, but that planet doesn't exist here. We're all human beings. And so it's that infrastructure. Secondly, if I look around, my mother and grandmother were very resilient people. They had different things that they had to work through in their life, but I think when you observe resilience around you as your role models, that kind of embeds that in you. And then third is taking care of yourself. Absolutely. So I try to do a little bit of yoga. I have other sports that I try to do. I recently picked up again after an absence of 20 years, beach volleyball. That's been great. I've been enjoying it. A little bit injured, but it's boosted my resilience significantly.
Fantastic. Well, that is fantastic. I had one last question, which was what the most urgent needs for career women are during COVID. And I have to say that it sounds like having that network of support is really crucial. And for men and women, I think that resilience is about having a good support network as you try to go beyond your current limits. So thank you both very much for the time that you've spent with us and for sharing both your personal stories and the wider research from IFC and JP Morgan and some of the stories that you know of from your from your wider network as well, the investments. Thank you so much. And back to the Asia Society.
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Rana. You three really inspire me. And especially some of the comments you made in the end. We can't do this alone. And I think I want to thank all three of you. And Diana, I just checked. We have not done a program with you on Future Proof. So you're on the hook for one, because I think a lot of what we've talked about today, it is future proofing. And let's use the time of COVID to really make ourselves prepare for the future. And I think a lot of the stuff that you said, all of you said, have resonated with me. A seat at the table, Laura. So last time you sat at a table with me, you ended up here. But it is really this wonderful network of that, supporting women supporting each other. And I think it must be Muhammad Yunus, Nobel laureates. I may be misquoting here, but I think he said investing in women is not just about investing it's not just good for women, but it's really good for society. And we know that. And so all three of you are inspiration. And I think another person I also want to mention, in the past, Asia Society has honored game changers like Malala Yousafzai. And having heard her, she's young, like Greta Thunberg, a lot of these young women, including Laura's daughters, they're really they have great expectations for us. And I have a 7.5-year-old niece, Emma, and a lot of what we're doing here today, I think hopefully will inspire her. And I want to pay a tribute to the male allies. In Malala's case is her father, as well as both her parents. And in my case, it's my parents and definitely my father. And I want to say, Dad, thinking of you. So health and family first. Those are the things I say to my colleague. Health and family, I've said it to them many times this last 9 years. Health and family first. During this really difficult time, it's going to get us through COVID-19 and the future, and it's going to make us all better for it. So thank you. Thank you. And I look forward to welcome any of you back in the future so we can continue the discussion. This is only the beginning. I think COVID has unearthed a lot of interesting feelings that needs to be further discussed. And I think this is where the social science also comes in. It's not just the hard science. Yes, we need to know the facts, but also the facts of what all three of you brought to light today, which I'm truly grateful. And again, thank you all for joining us on this Asia Society Hong Kong Center program. And we look forward to welcoming you back in future programs. And a special program like this, we need your support, and please join us for future program, and please join us as member. Good afternoon.